The Vietnam War is one of the most unpopular wars back home that the United States military has ever fought. Soldiers fought a bloody war against an enemy with hundreds of thousands of soldiers that hated the fact that Americans invaded their country for the sole purpose of containing communism. The spread of communism during the Cold War was the main foreign policy phenomenon the government targeted, as U.S. policymakers felt it presented a direct threat to capitalism and the American way of life. Men in their late teens and early 20s were drafted to fight in a war against a nation that most American people could not pinpoint on a map. Because the war had become so unpopular, soldiers returning from war were treated as scapegoats and were treated horribly by war protesters. After 3 years of war in mid-1968, anti-war sentiment was rampant throughout the population when news broke out that innocent Vietnamese civilians were being killed at the hands of United States soldiers. Over 2 million Vietnamese civilians were killed over the course of the war, many by American soldiers, sailors, and airmen. Automatic weapons, high explosives, and napalm were widely used by the United States against the Vietnamese to kill in mass amounts. The war, after all, was a war of attrition for the Americans. American leadership came to the conclusion that the only way to defeat the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA for short, was to eliminate as many of them as they could. In 1969, Hill 937, or better known as Hamburger Hill, was captured by the Americans after thousands of deaths on both sides of the battlefield, and later abandoned a few days after, as there was no real reason to leave war resources there to defend it. The Viet Cong and NVA later reoccupied the hill after the Americans left. Another incident where civilians were being killed at the hands of U.S. soldiers was known as the My Lai Massacre, where almost 500 innocent South Vietnamese civilians were murdered by U.S. soldiers. The U.S. tried to hide the atrocity, but it was exposed to the public a year later. Weapons like Agent Orange and napalm helped the Americans amass great body counts, but only at the cost of some innocent civilians losing their lives in the process. Once word of this broke out to the general public back in the United States, many Americans were outraged. Most Americans were not happy about being in Vietnam in the first place, as both U.S. casualties and Vietnamese civilian deaths mounted as the war went on. Hearing that children were being killed at the hands of our soldiers made the war even more unpopular, while it made soldiers look as if they were monsters. The public painted these soldiers as if they were all guilty. Whether they were responsible for the death of innocent civilians or not, they were guilty by association. Anti-war protests broke out on college campuses that received great media attention across the nation. It was becoming quite clear that the conflict in Vietnam was not popular back home. As soldiers finished their tours, they began to come home in droves as Vietnamization began to take place. Vietnamization was the process of removing U.S. soldiers from the battlefield and replacing them with U.S.-trained South Vietnamese soldiers that were outfitted with American weaponry. Vietnamization was enacted by the Nixon administration in 1968 as a substitute for victory. Most soldiers felt uneasy on the plane ride home as they wondered what they would face back in the real world from the American people. Soldiers knew that the war was being protested back home, but they had no idea how bad things had gotten. There are numerous accounts of soldiers being spat upon by anti-war protesters as they had landed. Linda van der Vanter, an Army nurse who had completed her tour overseas in Vietnam, witnessed this firsthand. She needed to get to San Francisco International Airport after she arrived stateside, so she would be able to take a flight to get back home. The only problem was her Army bus only took her as far as Oakland. She decided to hitchhike her way to San Francisco, which was about 20 miles away. Linda soon noticed that instead of giving her a ride, oncoming cars would not stop, but instead yell vulgar obscenities at her for her uniform. Finally, a car stopped and pulled over. The driver of the car wore hippie attire, a peace sign t-shirt, wire-brimmed glasses, and drove a Volkswagen bus. The driver stepped out and told her the reason he had stopped. "We're going past the airport, sucker, but we don't take army pigs," he said. He then proceeded to spit on her, get back in his car, yell more obscenities at her, and then floored the gas pedal. Soldiers finishing their tours, fighting for the nation that they loved so dearly, must have felt devastated to be treated this way upon their return home. Dennis J. Stauffer was another soldier who had faced backlash after he came back home from Vietnam. 14 years after the war, he decided to publish an article in the Grand Rapids Press, where he explained some of his experiences once he landed back in the States. "I kept quiet because the war was not a welcome topic outside the walls of veterans clubs," Stauffer explained. "The Viet Vet became a scapegoat for our country's involvement in an unpopular war. We faced rejection and verbal, sometimes physical assault. That's why many veterans quickly discarded their uniforms after returning home. It was easier than facing humiliation in public places." Although he felt humiliated by the public back home, Stauffer never forgot his comrades from the war, and made a point to visit the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. after it opened. Many of the protesters of the Vietnam War were students on college campuses. After the draft was activated, college enrollment soared through the roof, as students in college were generally exempt from having to serve. This was one of the reasons that led to so many students becoming protesters of the war. A major event that led to hundreds of protests across the country was the invasion of Cambodia in 1970. President Richard Nixon and his advisors reasoned that the Cambodian invasion was to cut off the supply trails the Viet Cong were using, which kept their war effort afloat. The public back in the United States saw Cambodia as an innocent country that had no real reason to be invaded. They felt that Nixon was escalating the war rather than ending it. Protests erupted on college campuses across the nation. Many student activists were shot during a protest at Kent State University, killing 4. 2 more were killed at a protest at Jackson State College. In total, there were over 1,300 colleges that held protests across the United States. The treatment of American soldiers following their return from fighting in the Vietnam War was the direct result of fighting a war that the majority of Americans came to reject. Looking back at how these soldiers were treated serves the American people a valuable lesson. The men and women that fight overseas are not responsible for the decisions made by the government. These people sacrifice so much so that the Americans back home can live the lives that they are accustomed to living. Regardless of how one may feel about the wars that our soldiers have to fight, we must always respect them and support them no matter what. A soldier putting their life on the line to defend our country is the most honorable thing a citizen can do. Protesting a war represents all of the principles that America was founded upon, most importantly, freedom. If a time comes where we must protest a war in the future, we must always remember the sacrifices that our soldiers make, and treat them with the respect that they deserve. We must also make sure that we hold our government accountable, so that our military is not put into any more difficult situations such as the Vietnam War ever again. Soldiers have a duty to fulfill. Civilians back home must fulfill theirs as well.